Halloween is over, but we're still handing out candy to the kids. That means we're either in serious trouble or we're playing Little Nemo on this episode of Doki Doki Game Club. Game Club. Hello and welcome to Doki Doki Game Club, a retro video game podcast. I am your host, Brandon Fincher, and I am joined today by the Crown Princes of Nightmareland, Frank Martin.
Yes.
Brian Grogan.
Hey there.
And Mr. Joseph Lester.
Hello.
On Doki Doki Game Club, each of our co-hosts takes a turn choosing a particular title from video game history, and we announce the selection online so everyone can play along at home. From there, we have 2 weeks to spend with the game, at which point we reconvene for a deep dive into the nuts and bolts of the selection. Today's selection was made by yours truly, and the title, as you may have gathered, is Little Nemo, the Dream Master for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Okay, so Little Nemo was released in 1990, first in North America in September that year, and then later on in December was released in Japan and the European nations. Do any of you guys recall Little Nemo coming out, like here, as children? I mean, first off, how old is everybody? What kind of time frame are we looking at here?
I'm 36, so I was like 9 years old when this came out.
Yeah.
And I do remember it coming out, and I remember pretty much everyone seemed to have it. At least everyone that I was friends with. So I was pretty familiar with it at the time. What about you guys?
How about you guys? Yeah.
Yeah, I was 39, or I'm 39 now. So I guess I was 12 when it came out. I guess I remember coming out, but I do remember it being pushed pretty hard in Nintendo Power. You guys remember that?
Oh yeah, they had a full like 8 to 10 page spread about Little
definitely.
Nemo. Maps and everything, just like
this doesn't make for good. This doesn't make for good podcasting. But in our chat earlier, we were passing around the commercial that was originally released for this one. And aside from it being awful, I just have no recollection of it.
I've never seen it before.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And I think like most kids at that, at our age in that time frame, Nintendo Power was better than the Bible. And I think that if you weren't aware of game news based on that magazine, then you just would go to Toys R Us or something. Yeah, you're completely oblivious. And yeah.
Well, Frank, what about you? Because you have a uniquely Canadian perspective on all these releases.
Uniquely Canadian and uniquely young, because I am 31 as opposed to all. And, and much younger than you guys. And I was 4 or 5 years old when this game came out, so I don't remember any commercials or anything like that about it.
Well, let me ask you this then. What was your first memory of this game? Like, how old were you? I mean, was this something that you discovered recently when you decided to do the show, or does it? Okay.
No, I played this when I was a kid. I don't remember how old I was, but I do remember like a cousin or, a neighbor of a cousin or something like that having it and then playing it on their NES. This was obviously before the SNES came out. And, being very intrigued by it because of this whole mechanic of animal swapping and so on.
Yeah. And we'll get into that more in detail later. I just want to share briefly, as a bit of a digression, that my sister, who was 3 years younger than I am, and I had a gaming. We were reared to play video games. My parents had an Atari before we were even born, and we have some fond memories of playing Little Nemo, the Dream Master. In particular, it's such a strange one and such a weird digression, but we live in Florida, and we sometimes over the seasons get really bad hurricanes, and I can remember one in particular where we just got rocked and power was out for several days. And so we relocated to a hotel that had the power on. And I can distinctly remember us taking the Nintendo with us. And one of the games we played for hours was Little Nemo.
Nice.
And so that's always this like strange, like post-hurricane hotel game for us.
Those are the best gaming memories. Yeah.
Yeah. It's weird.
Yeah. I didn't actually know anybody that had it, but I did rent it. And basically, I'm surprised you had many fond memories of it. I guess because maybe you owned it, but I had this time crunch. I'm trying to beat this game, and I in my mind, I got pretty far in it, and playing through it, as an adult, like I didn't get anywhere. Third levels, that's nothing. That's the train level, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to
Well,
that.
I had the same feeling though, because when I was playing it for this, I realized that as a kid, even though I have these fond memories of it, I don't think I got anywhere in it. I must have only played the first stage over and over again.
Oh, yeah, that is certainly the clearest memory in my mind, and I can imagine there were probably plenty of instances of us firing this game up, playing it, getting frustrated, and turning it off, or loading up something else. But yeah, and I'm going to be honest with our listeners at home here. Okay, I'm going to get quiet and low here real quick. I'm a filthy casual.
It's true.
There, I said it. And I owned a Game Genie as a kid, and I can distinctly remember playing Little Nemo with a Game Genie, and I'm sure it was an invincibility code of some sort. So I surely saw the end of the game, but until recently, until actually we decided to record this show, I did not play this game from
legally,
front to back. Legally, legitimately.
You had a djinn helping you the rest of the times.
Yeah, exactly.
So should we do the like history of it, or kind of like where this even came from in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's important to like. Not too many games. Well, I suppose there are probably plenty of games that share an intellectual property with some other medium. But this one in particular is interesting. Yeah. I mean, this one is the concept. The property of Little Nemo is long running. Windsor McCay, who was an illustrator, who worked for, it's a New York magazine, and I really should have prepped that note. But he originally created Little Nemo back in 1905, and across a couple of periodicals, it ran until 1926. Which, if you do yourself a favor, if you've played the video game and maybe you've seen the movie that the video game is based on, do yourself a favor, go and look up Windsor McCay's art. It is breathtaking, and he has like such a amazing sense of color. There's like such soft pastels, but it's still vibrant. It's hard to describe, but it's definitely a guy who breathed life into this idea of like a child dream,
Well, it's massive too. Like if you've ever seen any of the actual kind of some of the spreads that he did in the paper for Little Nemo, they're enormous. And I can only imagine, I haven't seen the original art, but it must be, twice as big, 3 times as big.
They're huge. And I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on Windsor McCay's art in particular, but he was a guy, I mean, if you look at the time frame of when he was doing this, he was doing things with the comic book panel that no one would do for, 50 years or something later. I mean, massive hot air balloons framed in a circular frame, surrounded by like negative space, and it's just all sorts of stuff. Super fascinating and highly, highly recommended. So from Windsor McCay's art, 1926 was when Little Nemo ended as a comic strip, and it would kind of pop back up in pop culture for the years to follow. But it wasn't until I believe it was in the 70s that Yutaka Fujioka, who is famous and famous for some things that I'm actually quite fond of, he was best known for his work on Lupin the Third and Golgo 13, which I know some of you guys are into. Totally. I'm not super familiar with Golgo 13, but and then lastly, some people that are listening to this might be aware of the wonderful, beautiful 80s cartoon Visionaries. With the opposing forces of good and evil, with the knights and the holographic. He was involved in that hugely. So he wanted to make this, wanted to turn Windsor McCay's artwork into a movie, into an animated film, way back, dating back to the 70s. And there's actually information out there that states that he contacted George Lucas to help him with this around the time that Star Wars came out. So George was just making a name for himself, and the Yutaka Fujioka came to him and tried to get this thing going, and Lucas just wasn't having it. Apparently, like a common thread with Fujioka was that he had tried to get multiple people attached to this project, and a lot of them had a problem with the fact that Nemo, through the course of the story that he was presenting to them, didn't really show much of like an arc. Like there wasn't any growth as a character. So it's kind of an aside, but I thought it was pretty interesting.
I thought you were going to say because he didn't put any clothes on besides his pajamas at all.
No, I mean, that's like his absolute trademark, those white PJs with the pop collar.
Yep.
Yeah, so in 1989, he finally got things off the ground, and in various stages of involvement, Mobius, Jean Girard, famous French, I'm probably butchering that name, you'll have to forgive me, Frank, but famous French writer and illustrator. The guy's stuff is as breathtaking to me as Windsor McCay, and you can certainly see some influence. Like I would love to have seen or heard an interview with Mobius to see if he cites McCay's work, because it's definitely there. The sort of soft detail in the faces, and massive amounts of background detail and that sort of thing. Super interesting. And so Mobius kind of fleshes out the concept of the film. And if you watch the movie, which I did recently, you can see that. I mean, as a kid, I had no idea who Mobius was, but as an adult, it was, having been exposed to Mobius, it made a lot more sense. There are things that you can see in his art. So I have to imagine that he really, worked closely along with Fujioka to try to get this thing looking the way he wanted it. And then at some point, he kind of just left the project, and the responsibility of fleshing out the screenplay fell on Chris Columbus, which, once again, people in our age range certainly know this guy's name, even if you're not familiar with it from memory. Home Alone, Goonies, Gremlins, and the first 2 Harry Potter films, Chris Columbus is responsible for all of those things. So, just really an amazing pedigree of people being involved in this. And, I promised myself I wouldn't get too involved in the movie. But have you guys seen the film before? Have you watched it recently?
Well, I just want to say, you mentioned Chris Columbus, and in the I didn't get to watch the movie. I'll tell you that right now. But in the commercial, I watched a commercial that was ripped from an old VHS tape of like The Princess and the Goblin or something, and the commercial opens with that pitch. It's like, from the director of Home Alone.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so he's like top billing for that movie.
Yeah. I mean, he was a huge name back then. So, I mean, yeah.
I remember watching it as a kid, and I remember, just being a kid watching a cartoon, so I didn't know like the impact on it. But it did make the rounds on TV. Like it was on a Sunday,
Nice. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't remember. We had access to a VHS copy of it as kids when it came out on VHS, and I don't have any recollection of ever seeing it on television here, at least. But we had the VHS, and once again, it was one of those weird things. The game. The film came out in 1989. The game came out in 1990. So it was obviously, they were very involved in like trying to keep things straight and inspired. And you can see that in the sprite art of the game. But there's definitely some things that were done differently.
Even the box art is very reminiscent to the movie as well.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, it still holds that Capcom flair. Sorry.
No, that's right. I had never heard of this until actually I was just researching Mobius, and then I saw that he was connected to Little Nemo, and I was quite surprised. And then I just flipped through the movie. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, but I was surprised how much was taken from the movie for the game, because I know sometimes games just have just kind of vestigial connections to whatever source medium that they come from, but that seemed to actually the characters and the bosses that you encounter.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of close similarities in terms of some of the things that they pull from, but then again, there are some things that are real off base about it. I mean, a 1990 NES game only has so much room to try and like flesh out a story. I mean, 1990 was still a point where like, with the exception of Final Fantasy games or like, JRPGs, like there really wasn't, in this sort of platforming game, there was just no room to put that sort of thing in. And obviously they spent so much time on making it look a certain way and then developing the mechanic of the animal transformation, which we'll get to in a bit. But it just doesn't, there are some things that are missing, and maybe we can talk about that briefly here. So I guess most importantly, like the general plot of Little Nemo in the film is like fleshed out and realized, and in the game it's a little bit it's obviously it's simpler, it's truncated, but there's also like one thing that I was painfully aware of when playing the game was it's really strange that Nemo wakes from his bed, is greeted by one of the Princess Camille's emissaries, who arrives in a giant blimp and presents Nemo with the candy, and then says, "I'm going to take you to Slumberland to be Princess Camille's."
Sounds so bad.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, not even, that's funny and all, but like not even that. But it's like, here's this idea. We're going to take you to Slumberland. I'm going to deliver you to the princess. You guys are going to be playmates, and it'll be great. When you start the game, you're in a mushroom forest with no explanation. And it's like, did something happen somewhere along the line that like the balloon needed? Because in the film, he goes right to the princess. And, so there was none of that in the game. And I mean, I'm obviously reading too much into it. And I'm putting too much pressure on a game, made for 10-year-olds in 1990. But, yeah, I don't know. Did anybody, did you notice that at all when you were kind of looking up the info about the movie?
I mean, I didn't think about it actually until you just mentioned it, because to me, I'm just like, I just take it. I'm like, okay, the game needs me to do some things before I get to whatever, But since I didn't see the movie, I didn't really make the connection that he would have just been taken to the princess. But it could have still used maybe, like, are keys a thing in the movie? Is that of importance?
Well, okay, yes. So keys, a key singular is very important in the film. Little Nemo doesn't have to collect keys, or he doesn't have to unlock multiple doors. And for the importance of the plot, there is one massive door that Nemo is bequeathed like a fancy royal key and he's told specifically, do not open this door with the sigil sigil of this key on it. Stay the hell away from the store. And of course he opens it, but it is a part of the game. But I just feel like one more frame, like one more cut scene moment of the blimp going down, or some sort of explanation on why you can't get to the princess.
I was thinking maybe the blimp goes down and then you collect things to kind of get the blimp going again. Would have made even more sense.
I had the very same thought. Like it shouldn't have been keys. It should have been something else. Remind me when we get into the conversation of like the layout of this game. I've got some roses and thorns moments where I'd like to talk about some things that work. And
I'm wondering if the developers of the game thought of it as like comic strips. So level 1 would be a chunk of a comic strip, and then level 2 would be another comic strip. More so than the movie,
and maybe even like fleshing out on that idea is the very subject matter of what we're talking about, which is a boy who is having a dream. So
because he keeps waking up and he goes back to bed.
Exactly. So it should be disjointed, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being too hard on it. So the film was released. The game obviously did its best to try and keep some things involved in that, and did it pretty well. The Nightmare King, the manta ray, the giant stingray boss.
I was surprised to see that when I flipped through the movie. I was like, oh, okay, that is a thing. Yeah,
it's way darker, obviously. But I mean, Nightmare Land's pretty good. But like something always unsettled me about that giant stingray. the whole scene involving it is pretty spooky. But the character, the very first character you meet in the game, Flip, who is like this little troll clown guy who was voiced by Mickey Rooney. But when you meet him, like there's just no character to him in the game. It's just, and that's like that with all the NPCs. Hi Nemo, this is where you are. This is what you have to do. See you later.
It's sound advice.
And the character of Flip in the film is like a mischievous, the crown prince of mischief. And in the game, the first thing he says to you is, the forest is a dangerous place for little boys. You shouldn't be here. But the whole time in the movie, he's like, hey, I think you should open up this door and let hell unleash on Slumberland.
Well,
it is sound advice.
You say that, but like I was actually impressed that they actually, just the artwork, they had the dialogue boxes where they gave a detailed artwork of the actual NPCs that you're meeting. Sure, they didn't really get fleshed out, but you actually get to see what they look like up close. Like that was
absolutely
reminiscent of some sort of source material. Yeah.
It's a thing that, RPGs with text, so like going way farther forward, something that they do and is valued, you can look at like games like Lunar that would come out, several years later with, those sorts of portrait pictures. And yeah, it does. It's nice because you can't really see a sprite zoomed in. So it looks cool in that regard. Yeah, I'm literally just getting hung up on the.
I'd be curious to see if it would be the first game to ever do this.
Yeah. I wonder something worth researching.
Well, I guess I guess Capcom did that with like Commando, not Commando, but that guy with the arm.
Oh yeah, Bionic Commando. Yeah,
Bionic Commando,
that was earlier. Yeah.
Yes, I guess
Yeah,
they did it first, but
And Bionic Commando actually shares a pedigree with this, which we'll get to later on. Some people were involved. And speaking of the involvement of staff at Capcom, Capcom, awesome development house, has done just tons of stuff. And I think we would be remiss not to point out that the game designer of this, for whatever that term is worth, has done some amazing things for Capcom over the years. Tetsuya Minami is the guy's name, and he has done. I'm going to list them off here briefly. Ghouls and Ghost, excuse me. Super Ghouls and Ghost, Mega Man 6, Mega Man X, Aladdin, Resident Evil, and Phoenix Wright. And to various degrees, he was involved in all of those. And based on what I could find on Capcom's website, it seemed like it was pretty sufficiently involved. So, pretty amazing stuff. Capcom also released, while we're talking about the company, that same year, that was still a point in time, I think, that game studios were releasing console games and putting out arcade games. And there was an arcade game released just simply called Nemo. Do you guys have any familiarity with that?
yeah, I played it actually a couple of weeks ago.
Nice.
Yeah, it's not as good.
It's not as good. Yeah, and it's strange to play it, and it's a arcade platformer, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that the console market certainly excelled at in a way that arcades just never, in my opinion, never really came close. But it once again, based on the film, and does some really cool things with sprite art, and there are levels, where they hit the train level, they hit Nightmare Land. Some of the enemies are the same. So,
what are the visuals like?
If you played the game recently, or back when you were a kid, and you're hungry for more, I'd certainly say it's something worth playing. Obviously it's an arcade game, so you're not going to find an arcade with Nemo in it right now. So feel free to seek it out however you please. But it's definitely something worth playing at this point.
Adult in a onesie.
Yeah, it's 16-bit.
It's
It's 16-bit. So number one, it's got more color depth, but it's got a weird style to it. It's not.
It does have a weird style. The proportions of Nemo are strange. He's like an adult in size. He still looks like a kid, but he's just like tall, and it's a little bit weird. I will say the one thing that they do in the arcade version that they did not do in the NES version completely, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but is the fact that in the NES version, Nemo's hair is purple for the most part with a black outline around it. And in the arcade version, it's black, which is what the comic book is, which is what the animated film is. And we can talk about, why they would make him purple instead of black at some other point. But, definitely the arcade game is definitely worth playing. It's not great, so don't expect it.
It's not an overly fun game.
No. And so that arcade game, I'm not quite sure if it was released here in North America, but I'm pretty sure it was a Japanese exclusive. And while we're talking about Japanese exclusives and the sort of differences in characters, I wanted to briefly touch on the Japanese differences versus the North American and European releases. So it's strange. Flip in the animated film has a smoking habit, and it's like part of his character, and it's part of the plot towards the end of the game. And in the North American version, he has no cigar in his mouth, but in the Japanese release of the NES game, he's chomping on a stogie. And keeping with that, the developers for the North American version also cut out the fact that the gorilla that Nemo gets to ride, and I think that starts in level 2 or 3?
2.
He has a cigar hanging out of his mouth in the Japanese version, and if you look closely on the North American NES version, all they did was remove the cigar from his mouth. So
Right.
if you ever notice that the gorilla has a stupid expression on his face,
Yeah, his lips are kind of open.
exactly,
For
like
no
they
reason.
literally just chopped out his, or I'm sure there's more to it than chopping, but yeah, they just chopped it out.
They should have colored it yellow. Just made it a banana.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it could have been
Right.
anything. Yeah. But fascinating stuff, and those are the two main differences. There was a history of North America, Nintendo of America, like removing religious iconography and and alcohol and drugs and that sort of thing. So I'm not surprised to see that in 1990, but I did find it interesting. Okay, so now I think we should probably go ahead and dive into the thing I think that makes Little Nemo the most unique of its platforming brethren from that era, and I think that's the unique mechanic of the animal transformation. I'm not quite sure what else to call it. He doesn't always turn into something else.
Well, he doesn't actually turn into it at all. He either gets on the back of the animal or he gets inside of him, which is kind of creepy.
Yeah,
But-
very creepy.
Yeah, that's the disturbing part.
That's the thing. That's another one of those hand wave. It's a child having a dream moment. It's not. He's not literally climbing into his, into his esophagus. So the game is completely focused on this particular detail, and I'm going to come right out and say that I feel like sometimes it doesn't work very well. Sometimes it gives you these characters. Well, you know what? Here, let's take a step backwards. So maybe somebody wants to talk in greater detail how the mechanic of this animal transformation. I don't know what else to call it. Does somebody want to talk about how does it play in the game? Let's go.
Oh, you mean how close is it to real life? How you can possess animals? Because just like in real life.
No. Like
Like
how do you do it? How do you do it in the game?
Nemo has candy that he can throw, and he has an unlimited supply. So if you throw this candy at a normal enemy, it just stuns them briefly, which is like it's useful maybe once every 100 times you face an enemy in the game. It's not very. Yeah, pretty much never. You never really try and do it.
Never, yeah. I think once you discover that it works, you go, oh, you hit the massive purple snail in level 1, and then it like stops for a second, and then you go, well, this is useless because it keeps coming after me. So you keep spamming candy at it, and then, eventually you figure it out.
There's one place where it is useful, but that's later on in the game, pretty late.
Yeah, I think 95% of the time when I threw candy and stopped an enemy, I was disappointed because I was like, no, I don't want to do that because now I have to wait for them to start moving again.
Yeah, exactly.
Or something. So there are certain creatures, like there's a frog, there's a gorilla, there's a bee, and so on. Certain creatures you can throw the candy at, and if you throw 3 pieces of candy at them, then they will go to sleep. And at that point, you can hop on them or in them, or however Nemo decides to possess them in his like wicked way.
Right.
So, and then they let you traverse the level in a different way.
Exactly. And it's very cool, and there's certainly some level design and play that not only makes it a requirement, obviously, like if you can't get up high unless you have something that can take you up high, but the overall flow of the level design, sometimes it hits and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes you'll get an ally, an animal ally with the candy, and then you'll use it for 10 seconds. And then there's another animal ally where it's like, okay, now we're just going to, drop this guy with the select button, take this other guy. And I just felt like there was, especially the ones that are really cool, like the bee, the one that can fly. There wasn't a long stretch of game where I got to feel like I was navigating the world in an interesting way and attacking enemies or fighting or, dodging attacks. I don't know. Do you guys feel that the animal mechanic was used sufficiently, or am I just being too hard on it?
I think if the game would have been a little bit bigger, like let's say on the Super Nintendo, where it had multiple routes depending on which animal you would have had, so like a over the air route with the bee, or you go underground with the gopher, because the gopher you literally use it once, I think.
Once,
yeah.
You're right.
In the first level, you get the gopher, you get 2 key. You need it for 1 key. The second key you can't use them.
Yeah.
And then it's absolutely useless. So that would have been so much better. Or like those snails. Like there's a lot of like cool, but obviously the NES can't have that big of a level, right? So it's give and take. So
I also thought it was kind of weird that some of the I don't know, there wasn't parity in some of the creatures you could possess. Like the fish could swim fast, but really didn't have any other abilities. It wasn't any better than the frog.
Oh, I don't think did you notice that he had arms and would punch?
I noticed he had arms. I didn't notice how the punching went.
Unless I'm completely mistaken, did anyone else?
No.
Am I remembering that wrong?
Maybe.
I don't think I used him at all.
Yeah. So he's only in one spot in the game. He's a massive red fish with giant boogly eyes, and there's literally no reason to use him because, I mean, yeah, he swims fast, but he has a larger hit detection box, and the area that you need him for sends you through this water catacomb type thing where
Right.
these spiral crustaceans are like I'm not sure what I'm talking about. They kind of look
Yeah.
like
The ones
upside
that
down
jet
ice cream
up?
cones.
They
Yeah,
jet up,
exactly.
yeah, right.
Yeah, and so there's like a place that you have to get him and then backtrack to go through this area, and there's just no benefit to it. But I'm almost positive that he has arms and punches.
I'm looking at I was very much expecting him to punch. I'm looking at the fact right now. There's no punching.
You're dreaming.
Am I? Okay. Well, then I completely stand
Yeah, I
corrected.
think you're dreaming.
For some reason, I saw those stupid arms. Yeah, maybe I took some.
I was completely expecting it, and then you
Yeah.
have something like the bead that can pretty much go everywhere, and they can
And do
shoot
everything.
needles.
But the bee thing is,
and he has 4 life bars.
yeah. So let's talk about that briefly. Like, I thought that was kind of a neat idea that depending on which animal you join up and interact with, you see an increase in your health. But what was cool about it, I mean, the game is pretty simple most of the way, and I mean that in terms of difficulty. But they give you more health, but there is no health in those health spots. They're just empty. The capacity for more health is there. But the game is pretty good about throwing health at you constantly. But it's just this satisfying little thing where you go, okay, I'm going to be the gorilla now, and I have 6 boxes instead of just Nemo's default 3. So I can play the game a little differently. I can be maybe a little more aggressive and take a hit from the float fiends or whatever without having to like freak out and dodge them. Which we'll talk about those float fiends here in a second. I see Frank chomping at the bit. But yeah, the mechanic of the animal thing is awesome. And as a kid, I think I was in love with it. I thought it was just the coolest thing ever. As an adult, I may have been a little. I'm being very not critical, but I'm being critical. But I think I am looking at these games that we're playing that we're hoping to cover on the show with a certain lens of so it makes for interesting conversation.
Rose tinted glasses.
Well, no, I quite the contrary, because I think that
glasses.
as a kid, complete blackouts where I'm like, this game is shit. I can't figure out how to play it. But no, I forgot where I was going.
But it's like Joseph said earlier. Like he said that he remembers the game as a kid, but playing it back is like I think I just played the first level over and over. But I think our imagination. At least for us that didn't own it. I know, Brendan, you owned it, and then you killed it because you were a cheater. But
You ruined it.
I remember just falling in love with the idea of oh shit, there must be these other levels with all these other animals that I'm gonna get, and then you go crazy. You're like, oh shit, I'm gonna do all this cool stuff, but you never even get there.
It definitely does capture the imagination, and I think that's once you know how the mechanic works, it is definitely a thing that drives you forward. And in the game, you go to different levels and you have the fun of playing in those levels, and some of them are more fun than others. But it is, like you said, it is, oh gosh, there's an ally. Let me toss some candy at him. And
then he's useless.
Yeah, well, and then he's useless, yeah.
Or like you use him to get to another one.
Yeah. I mean, and that becomes a problem much later on.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to talk to that effect when we kind of cover the layout of the levels.
Sure.
in general.
Well, one note I had about the animal mechanic was that I just really enjoyed being a frog. I was obsessed with frogs as a kid, and I would always want to be the frog in the game, which is the same thing with Super Mario Bros. 3. I would always try to keep that suit as much as possible, to my detriment. Complete trash unless you're outside of water, or unless you're in water. So with that note, do you think this animal control mechanic or this animal suit mechanic had anything to do with Super Mario Bros. 3? Was that an influence?
Boy, I almost guarantee that it has to be. Well, here's the thing, though. You have to trace that thought back to how Japanese developers operated during that time frame. So do you think that Capcom, and do you think that because what was the development cycle on an NES game, like how far in advance did they have to plan that detail? Because I'll tell you one thing, the film that we mentioned earlier, there is no Nemo transforming into an animal. There is plenty of animal presence in the film. There is a sequence where they're traveling across Slumberland and they're being pulled by rams, and there's with like this ram cart, they hop over alligators, which is a thing that you see in Nightmare Land. So animals are certainly a part of Little Nemo, But
I feel
yeah,
like it's more probably influenced by Capcom's game designs at the time, because if you look like Mega Man, you capture your abilities and you
exactly.
I think it's
The
more so.
idea-
I think it's more so Capcom than trying to not rip off, but be influenced by Super Mario 3. In my opinion, anyways, that's how I see
Yeah.
it.
You
I
could
mean,
say ripoff. My wife came in and saw me playing it. She's like, "This is just a ripoff from Mario Brothers 3." So,
Oh wow!
so that
Maybe
was
she
her
has a more
take.
discerning eye than we
Hot
do.
take.
Maybe
Yeah,
she needs to be on
right.
cast.
Wife cast.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right with Comcast, that being part of their business model at that point in time, because Capcom. Yeah, no, I think that was part of Capcom's design at the time, was surely that you obtain the ability to do different things in the game, and that's what's fun, and that's what keeps you going forward.
That's the gimmick. Otherwise, it would
Yeah,
be just a shitty platformer.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but like they probably needed something to do in the game because they're we'll get to it later, but it's not till later in the game that you actually get an ability, an offensive ability.
Right.
So
It could have been a good
they're
platformer.
like, what can we do?
if they did it right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really unique part, and something worth pointing out and maybe talking about in greater detail is that, you have the candy that we mentioned earlier that had the ability to stun, enemies in the game, but it was useless for the most part. And you could occasionally kill an enemy in, say, in gorilla form or in the bumblebee form. I'm not sure what other ones had an offensive attack, but
the
it's
mouse.
really-
mouse.
Crab and mouse.
the crabs,
Yeah.
yeah, the little hermit crabs, which is arguably my favorite sprite for Nemo transformation in the game, because he's so tiny inside of it.
It doesn't make any
It looks
sense.
really ridiculous.
Right, yeah.
But the offense doesn't really come in until later, and it is a game that's more about exploration in that regard. And
But that's another thing I wanted, since you mentioned it, and I don't know when this would fit in, but should we leave it to your imagination that he's always the same size, or is Nemo growing and shrinking?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it's the cop out of it being a
The
dream,
pixel
right?
size, yeah. And then the limitations of the game, like you can't
I don't know.
have-
He gets inside the bee's mouth somehow, so I'm not really. I wasn't really worried
but
about
He
it.
wears the bee as a
He
suit.
poofs. It's a poof of smoke anytime he transforms into
Sure.
these things or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I like the idea, as an adult, of some gross out body horror, Junji Ito scenario of Little Nemo climbing inside of everyone. But
A little bit of
yeah,
Cronenberg in
definitely.
there.
Because even in the cutscenes, he is more drawn like the comic books, where he's kind of a big and he's the size of the bed. But as he's running towards the bed, he's using the sprites of him running in a game, and he's small. Like
Yeah.
the consistency is not very there, and
it is a little all over the place, and I really wonder if that is a byproduct of
limitations. I would say.
limitation, or if it's a byproduct of Capcom not communicating clearly with
the original
with
source.
with the original source.
Maybe
Yeah.
because
But just briefly, I wanted to. You mentioned the bed, and I feel like that's a good opportunity to. I really feel like if that game wanted to throw auto scroller stages at you, which we'll talk about more in the stage part, but auto scrollers in general, if they really wanted to put that sort of level in this game, it should have been on the bed. Nemo should
Absolutely,
have flown
yeah.
that bed around like Aladdin in the Super
Yeah,
Nintendo.
it's like bed knobs and
Genesis version
broomsticks.
where he's
Right.
flying around on the carpet, because the bed is as important a part of the Little Nemo brand
Well,
as anything.
That's the U.S. Box art. He's flying on a bed.
Yeah,
exactly.
The bed's walking. Yeah, the bed's actually
Yeah.
walking. He's being chased by alligators and
Yeah,
trees.
but that's a thing. Like if you look at the most pivotal parts in Nemo art history, some of the most famous arcs involve this bed like traveling around on extended wobbly legs,
Yeah.
and so it's
that is the most
yeah.
iconic thing of
Yeah.
when I think of Little Nemo, is that bed in the streets of like New York or whatever, Boston, and those long legs, and he's just walking around the city.
That's gonna suck, by the way, if every time you dream you just take your stupid bed with you.
Well, the bed plays an important part in the movie. Like, there's a whole scene where Nemo keeps traveling back home to his bed, and only to find out that he's still in the dream. And so
He never wakes up.
he doesn't wake up, and it's weird. And like his parents are, they ignore him when he's in this dream state, and it's kind of dark and bizarre. But there's a part where things go real south in the story, and he ends up using this bed to float through the rivers of Nightmare Land and like fly through the air at one point. And I don't know, it's cool, and it just feels like a missed opportunity. But I realize there's a whole bunch of other stuff in this game, and they probably couldn't fit it all in there.
But that's what I mean. I think a 16-bit era game would have had more. Like Capcom for the Super Nintendo was just as good for NES. Like they made some real big bangers, and this would have been a cool IP to continue with.
Absolutely. And it feels like it was money in the bank, right? Like it's interesting. The art is cool. There's just a glut of, there's 21 years or something of story available to pull from. And it's funny to think back now from this day and age where game development has become this thing where it seems to be so difficult to get original IPs. And so people just make these successful franchises to death. Had Little Nemo come out now and done as well as it did then for the Nintendo, for some comparable system now, I think we would have seen half a dozen of these games. But
I feel like they were all about crossover cash, especially then, where it was like it had to coincide with a big event, and it was enough, tied into the movie where they could still kind of get away with putting it out there. Whereas I don't know if they really thought that it would be realistic to follow it up, 3-4 years down the line where there's no
movie,
cross media Little Nemo.
Right. Well, something to add to the fact that it never made it to the Super Nintendo, and to support that claim of being a sort of cash tie-in, is that the film for Little Nemo tanked. If you look at, I don't have the numbers up in front of me, but if you look at what the budget was, the box office gross was like a third of what the budget was. Ow. So it was a massive, massive failure. Despite, I don't want to talk anymore about the movie, but watch it, and it is both entertaining and charming in the way that like a Miyazaki film is, and it is breathtaking. Like the art is so nice, and it's just you don't see animated films like that anymore, where they would just spend a massive amount of time.
It looks expensive.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to term it. Okay, so while we're talking about the mechanics of how Little Nemo works, we've talked about the interesting. The interesting aesthetics and like the interesting transformation into the animal ally. But how do you feel? How do you feel control-wise the game feels to play? Like, is it fun? Like, do you feel that it's satisfying? Because in most games where platforming is the main focus of the game, which was a super popular genre during the 8-bit and 16-bit era, so much effort was put into dialing in the singular character that you would be playing to stop on a dime. Obviously the best case example of this would be any of the Mario Brother games. And with Nemo, I feel like there's some fluctuation. Obviously, I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on, do you feel that the mechanics overall were fun to play? They're satisfying?
Well, I think it was fun, but I think there was some crispness that was not... really not there. There's some polish in just kind of the gameplay. Like the hitboxes didn't seem really true to what you're seeing. Jumping over, as Nemo, you had to jump over enemies occasionally, and that didn't seem like
it was
very fair. Just the way it was.
Yeah,
right.
Trying to jump over those slugs, or I guess those things with the shells.
Yeah,
they were really hard to jump over.
Oh yeah,
because they're very long and they're very tall.
But do you not feel that is what the game is trying to do? Like Nemo can't jump over that; it's a pain in the ass. But if you're a frog, then so you take the separate path. And
I totally get that. You're not meant to play the game as Nemo. You're meant to get these power ups and
right. But I just think like the hitboxes and the sprites didn't really tell didn't match up the real story. Yeah, it didn't really match up.
If you want, in my opinion, a good example for a best case moment in the game where design and actuality could sort of come together. I can think of a few instances, and if it was the Topsy-Turvy or maybe it was Nemo's house, where part of getting from point A to point B involves you securing one of the bumblebees, right? So you get Nemo, he's in the bumblebee suit. And you need to get to a spot that is exactly as far as it needs to be before the bee's ability to continue to fly conks out, before the bee runs out of gas or whatever. And I got frustrated with that several times, because I was like, if you don't leap off as far over as you can get before you need to fly off, like if you don't get as far on the ground over, then you'll run out of gas and you fall all the way down. You have to do it all over again. Yeah. And so I thought that was kind of neat. I mean, like, that's the whole point of this game. And like, there are too many instances where it was like, well, I could have been any of these animals to do this. Obviously, the flying is a little easier to make that necessary, because not every animal can climb a ceiling. I mean, none of the animals can climb the ceiling, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I know what you mean. And yeah, it did feel like some of them were interchangeable. And I agree with Brian about the controls in general, just because it's not as precise as even some other Capcom platformers, I didn't think.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure not. Yeah. And I wonder too if the softness of the platforming, I guess I'll call it that. That sounds like the gentlest way to critique it. But if the sort of floaty nature or the weirdness of the weight of Nemo is part of why the game throws so much health at you. Because I mean, and it's still challenging.
Also,
you're still
Infinite
constantly
continues.
And Infinite continues, sure, and incorporating a level select option. Obviously they don't tell you about that. But
in my memory from X number of years ago when I did play it, I swore that I got to the train level and then I just ran out of continues. Like, that's what I was like, oh, that's what happened.
Yeah.
I
think your patience ran out of continues.
Yeah, I think that's the time, because I was running it. So.
Oh yeah. So
it's Monday morning. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked then. Was there anything else anyone wanted to add about the mechanics or controls? I don't want to push along unless Okay, so now we've covered mechanics and controls. We've talked a little bit about difficulty, but I want to focus a little bit on the sort of lay of the game. I don't want to be too abstract about or too quick about how we're going over this. So briefly, and I want to tie this back into the film, is that the lay of the land as far as stage progression goes, you start off as Little Nemo in the Mushroom Forest. Not something that's included in the film at all, that I recall at least. But the Mushroom Forest gives you an option to meet Flip, who is an important character in the film, not so much in the game, once again. But you start to, it holds your hand, and Flip teaches you that most of this game involves you traversing a map, collecting keys to unlock a door to take you to the next area. And as almost as important as the mechanic of transforming into animals is this key collecting device. So we learned this in the Mushroom Forest. Does anyone? Do you have any? We talked about the Mushroom Forest being the thing that people played and recognized the most with Little Nemo. Is there anything that anyone wants to talk about further with that, or is that kind of a?
One more note about the gameplay, or the design rather, was did anybody else get frustrated at the infinitely spawning enemies? And every time you took an enemy off the screen and then came back to that screen, you only have 3 health bars usually. And then
God, yes.
Yeah. Right.
So much so. And matter of fact, that's probably the source of challenge in this game.
Right.
Like if this game operated a little more like Castlevania, let's say,
right.
With in terms of enemy placement, I think it would have just been a pushover. Unfortunately, that feels like false difficulty, false challenge, because it just, like you said, it's just frustrating.
Well, the thing is, like, you have, you're getting all these different animal suits and you want to explore, but the more you explore, the more you just kind of bombarded with, the same enemy over and over again. And, you're going to fail eventually. It's
very unforgiving about it, too, because it's not just if you get out of the area and you come back, they're there. It's like if you go half a screen over,
3
like a
inches,
pixel, like a pixel beyond where they were, then they're going to be back.
And once again, I don't know why it's so vibrant in my mind, is Nemo's house and the upside down or topsy turvy. I've been watching Stranger Things. Yeah. But yeah, with the upside down stage, there's a lot of verticality to both Nemo's house
Yeah.
in those, which is cool because otherwise some of the stages I thought they did a really nice job of going horizontal and vertical. Some of them are more gradual and some of them is quite a bit, and that's really cool about this game that sets it apart, from other games. But that level in particular, for some reason, especially when you have the enemies that have they're chimps on top of stacks of plates.
Those are really
and
cool enemies, though.
Yeah, no, they're awesome, and that's the game does a great job of like going, oh man, that's such a cool design. Oh shit, he just killed me.
Yeah, right.
That's such a Capcom enemy too. That's like it's like straight out of Chippendale Rescue Rangers or something.
Yeah, or a Mega Man, like a non-robotic version of a Mega Man.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So after Nemo makes his way out of the mushroom forest and you've collected the required amount of keys, you do that pretty easily. You get to experience transforming into the frog, transforming into the lizard. Stage 2, the flower garden. We're still outside. We're still seeing some stuff. At this point, something that I thought was interesting was the character that you meet at the beginning it's not Flip anymore, and it feels like a wasted opportunity. Like you could have really fleshed Flip out and like given him more things to say, but instead you meet these goblins who are kind of, they're sort of important to the film, but they're kind of like a gimmick. Like it's just like a one-trick thing, right? There are like 5 of them, but you meet 4 of them, and then you get a 5th, or Nemo gets a 5th one in the film. And they're these goblins that can kind of like transform into a single thing, and then like separate into 5 different things with these different types of goblin personalities. But anyhow, in the flower garden, you meet the first one of these, Oompy, and I think the information that he gives you is even less than Flip does. He literally gives you some vague thing about going into the water.
Yeah, he's like, I got a buddy in there. Go check him out.
And then you go down to the buddy who gives you another piece of useless information about like you need the lizard to get through the game, or through the stage rather. And it's like, well, yeah, I don't know. Maybe when I was 10 years old, I found that useful, but at this point in time as an adult,
I'm wondering if it's something that didn't make localization. Like maybe the text in Japan actually had something like story-wise, but then Nintendo of America said
it's quite possible because there's a history of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you guys see on speedrunning that you can actually bypass that the NPC talking?
The dialogues? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You have to do some weird jumping
with
pressing start.
It looks like, I didn't read anything about it. I had no one explain it to me, but I watched it in the video, and as best I could gather, it was jumping and squatting and hitting start before the NPC has a chance to trigger the dialogue. But you can only continue to go forward so long as you do that until the enemy is off screen, or the NPC. I'm sorry.
Something like that.
That's what it looks like. I'm sure there's more to it than that because I'd spent 5 or 10 minutes trying to do it just to test it out, and I could not get it to work.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you won't be speedrunning this game then?
Well, not necessarily. It's once you do it, once or twice, it becomes a pretty simple game. But
if you know the route.
I've considered speedrunning before, but with something easy like this, like DuckTales, I can bash through DuckTales pretty simply.
Mm-hmm. That's for another episode.
Yeah.
The first 2 levels are really good as far as just being introductions for the mechanics, because they're both very similar. They're just key hunts, and they're in a very controlled environment. And it's one of those things that would probably have even more of a tutorial now if they made it. It'd be like tutorials every few steps. And I think it does a pretty good job of getting it across. You didn't even really need a lot of what is said, but it's fine.
Yeah.
It's kind of a fine little throwaway introduction to each level. So yeah, the first 2 are, and they're very similar in structure too. So
yeah.
And then it departs from there. I'll say that.
And let's move on to this next stage. So I briefly touched on auto scrolling earlier, and if you're a discerning listener, you might have heard the contempt in my voice. But this game is one of the worst cases of that, I find. So Nemo for stage 3 ends up in a house of toys, and it's a part of the film, which I'll give it credit. I believe this is the first point in time. There may have been a flower garden in the background of of the film, or maybe a mushroom forest that I wasn't aware of. But yeah, so House of Toys, an entire sequence of the film where Nemo meets the king of Slumberland. It's very important, and he's interesting, and it's this whole lovable train conductor thing. Oh my gosh, he's actually the king, like that sort of cliche. Yeah, spoiler. Mm-hmm. But so this game decides it's going to throw an auto-scroller at you, and it just bombards you with toy planes dropping bombs, parachuting bombs, changing up speeds. I'm not super good with it. Up and down, exactly. And I'm not super good with some of the speedrunner terminology, but RNG is something that I hear used frequently on speedruns. Say again?
It's the bomb dropping.
Exactly.
The bomb dropping is complete RNG because there's no pattern to it. It's there's no timing, so it's like they could drop one and then immediately.
But there has
drop
to be some memorized way of dealing with that, because when you watch speedruns of this game, there is certainly like they come out completely unscathed.
Well, what I notice is that he hits some of them with candy.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, there's your use.
Yeah,
for it.
I know in some of the speedrunners, if you keep some enemies on screen, then it'll despawn some of the other enemies. So that's probably keeping one of those planes on screen longer. Probably despawns another one or something. So it probably helps.
No, that would make sense.
So yeah, the train autoscroller is kind of it was kind of my first really frustrating point with the game.
Absolutely.
Where I died a ton, and it does the most criminal thing that an autoscroller does. It's too long.
It is too long. And so here's the thing, right? It's difficult in a way that once you have memorized the layout of the train tracks, it's not rewarding anymore. I guess maybe I need to clarify that a little bit. In the platforming segments of Little Nemo, it's challenging in certain areas, and you suffer and you die for it, and then once you learn it, it's fun to move through the level. Well, in this, and maybe this is more a problem with auto-scrollers in general, is that you go on this same path, you have no control over the path that you take, and there are no animal allies with which you can transform into. So it's already like, I guess maybe the idea was to give you a break from that, but that's the whole
no
point
one wanted
of
a
the
break
game, so I wasn't quite sure. Exactly. I don't know. It just feels punishing at a bad point in the game. I mean, I don't know. Anyone have any other thoughts on that? Did anyone struggle? I mean, it sounds like Joseph suffered with it. Did anyone else have as much of a hard time as I did?
I suffered in one part that I had to I would keep dying before I got the timing of it, is when it would start going down, and then there was some keys that looked like you weren't be able to catch while jumping, but you were. So I was always trying to time it, jumping on one of those kind of piers that they would have.
No, that's a fool's errand there. If you jump on that pier, that's flying squirrel city.
Yeah, exactly. It's the flying squirrel thing, and then you end up jumping too much or too little, and then you hit the spikes and you just die, which is fine. And then so you had to time it perfectly, and then I figured out that you
know what's great about that? If you don't collect all the keys, they actually show up at the end.
So I think that you can collect all the keys, and there is still an extra key left there at the end.
There's a couple.
If it's not that level, then there's another level that. See, the old man's memory here is foggy. But there is certainly one where it's like there is an extra key, because you'll go in and punch them all through, and the stage ends, and there's a key. At least for me, there was one left over afterwards. But I don't think that I ever survived until the very end, only to find that I had missed a key, because they're all sort of there, but then there are you get two at the beginning, and then there's one or two during the stage itself, and then there's just a bunch of them at the end.
I just think that it's great that everybody's dying to get this one key, and you don't even need
you can just completely avoid
extra,
it.
Well, I imagine that was a playtesting thing too. They probably didn't have that at first, and they realized that it basically you would have to reset the game if you got to the end, and there wasn't a way to die or get all the keys.
Right. Yeah.
So
or just an auto kill. You just get there and then die.
No suicide for Little Nemo.
Yeah.
He eats poison candy.
You mentioned that the descent on the train tracks, and I have a note here about. I just put literally in the notes: spikes are bullshit. Sides kill you. That's something so frustrating, because these spikes are gigantic. They're literally the length of Nemo sprite, and I can understand hitting the bottom. Like if you jump up into one, that's video game 101. But like something to me, I don't know. Maybe it's my years of playing Dark Souls games where it's like I can touch all these enemies, and so long as I don't get hit by the enemy, then I'm fine.
You're right.
Yeah, no, that was really frustrating because that made it a very pinpoint, accurate kind of means of dodging.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then because Nemo is so nimble, which he's not, but yeah, it makes things a little
sarcasm.
Sarcasm in brackets.
Mm-hmm. So moving on from the third stage, the House of Toys, we head back to another platformer, which is the Night Sea. And this is the first time in the game that we kind of see a transition from day to night. And this one involves a whole new category of animal companion and a bunch of new enemies. And that's one of the things. I mean, obviously they're going to reuse some enemies throughout the game, but it's satisfying to see 4 stages in going, oh, okay, well, there's still cool new stuff here. And it's not a Mega Man game, but I mean, maybe that's just a Capcom trait to continually introduce new enemies and not really do a lot of reusing. But
it's the water level.
This is the water level, yeah.
Which is okay because it's not a bad water level. I don't particularly hate that level personally.
Yeah, it's not the dam for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
No.
Yeah.
It also has one of the more interesting mechanics for an animal transformation with the little hermit crab.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
satisfying, like such a fun little sprite. Being able to dig down. I mean, he operates much. He's like a more fun water version of the mole, which you only get to use the one time. But
a more fluid and like maneuverable version of the mole, because the mole is absolutely useless. They can't go up, can't jump, can't do anything.
Well, and I just thought it was really creative too, because it's not many games would think to do this, where it kind of leaps up in the water and then dives back down to dig deep, with its piercing the actual dirt. And I don't know, I just thought that was kind of a cool little way to do it. They could have just had him burrow in and made it kind of generic.
Okay, and moving on from stage 4, after the Night Sea, we end up in Nemo's house, which is cool, and I think that's it's a thing that is shared by both the original comic book and by the film that the game is mostly based off of, is that traveling back to Nemo's home.
But wait, is he tiny in the film?
No.
Versus his home, because he is here, which I thought
Nemo's
was neat,
home.
as and kind of a dreamscape kind of thing where you're
micro machines style.
Right.
And I think too, like if you think back to being, I'm not quite sure how old Nemo is supposed to be. If I had to guess, like somewhere in the 9 to 10 range. I don't know, especially based on the film. Like he looks like he's on the precipice of adolescence because of the relationship that they form between him and the princess.
And the girl is taller.
Yeah.
That's where the girls get the growth spurt sooner than boys.
But the Nemo's house being large feels like a thing that would be age appropriate for that point in time. It's like everything is bigger, like you go back and experience things. I mean, and what we're doing here on the show is a prime example of that, where, like you're playing a game and you go, man, this game was massive. And then we just sort of blow through it.
Yeah.
Or, you something else where like there's a time space distortion sort of a thing. So, there's, I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts to share specifically about Nemo's house? I mean, I like this is a neat level design. I think overall, because this is the first one where you really get vertical.
Yeah, I like that you get the mouse. The mouse is a cool kind of version of the salamander. This exact same, except you have a hammer.
Yeah.
And I think at this point with, and I want to touch on that since you're talking specifically about the mouse, is that I think this was the point in my recent playthrough where I noticed that Nemo's hair was black when he was in sprite form.
And then purple otherwise.
And then purple otherwise. Not sprite form, but when he's black, his hair is black when he is on one of the animals or inside one of the animals. It's such a strange thing, right? And I get that with a colorful animal, you wanted that to be the color and then the contrast. But like, there's so much color in this game that I think that Nemo's hair, if had it stayed black the whole time, would have popped.
There might have been a reason. I don't know.
Yeah. Some sort of mechanical reason, like
I
palette issue.
It might have been the sprite color combination too. Like there might have been, I don't know, like if he had hit the limit.
Yeah, I wonder.
You know,
maybe
of that.
I'm
for
thinking
his
maybe
character,
because
so-
it's the only character that you'll have on every background and every level.
Because some of the backgrounds are black.
And that's what
That's
I mean.
true.
And maybe they don't use purple in any other area, and they're just like, well, he'll
Yeah.
pop out with a white and a purple, right?
You know what else it makes me think of is Batman for the NES, the Sunsoft. Batman's obviously not purple, but I mean he's purple in the game, but he's not in real life, or in the comic books. But yeah, just a neat thing that I noticed.
But that level had the worst music, in my opinion.
Yeah, the music's
The
not
song
great.
is-
Are
The
you
song is
serious?
horrible.
That's my favorite track.
Are you
Really?
serious?
I like the layeredness to it. Like
To
I
me,
don't know, it reminds
it's
me.
like half heroic, and then all of a sudden it goes on this like weird kind of tangent.
Well, okay, the first half of the music is my favorite track.
Because that's what I mean. Like it's so, and it doesn't fit the level, in my opinion. Like it's not like I don't know. It's
kind of a
kinda
return
spooky.
home.
It's a
I thought it was
spooky
kind
type at one point, and you're like, it shouldn't be spooky, should it?
But between the two house levels, and I'm calling Topsy Turvy like a house level as well.
Okay.
Is one of the two has a sort of a waltz? Is that this level or Topsy Turvy?
Topsy Turvy.
Okay.
Yeah. So I like that. That's probably my second favorite track, but we'll cover that some
Yeah,
more.
we'll get to that later.
Well, one thing about this kind of brings me back to this level in general, brings me back to what Frank said earlier. You know, the way that you use the animals, I think it was you, Frank, that was saying that it would be more fun if you could just kind of choose them to whichever one you needed, or maybe it was Brian, like whichever, if like, let's say you wanted to use the bee and go above the level, and that would be fun.
Yeah. There would be multiple routes in a level, depending on which
With this one,
animal.
it's these levels, this and Topsy Turvy, they make it very strict routing. Where it's like you need to go down here, you need to get this lizard, then to get the bee, then to get, and it's so strict that it almost, replaying it, because I did die a lot in this level, it became really robotic for me to go back and do it again.
And how'd you guys like how you have to drop down to this place where you thought you might die?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of that in
That
this
was-
game. There's a lot of
Yes.
being able to go
Yes,
where
there
you
is.
would normally die.
Yeah, like,
Right.
oh, I'm going to
Yeah.
swim down here. Oh, wait, it's a cave all of a sudden. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to point out that this level, if I'm not mistaken, I'm really bad with getting Nemo's house and Topsy Turvy confused, but one of the two stages involves like a long stretch of the level where you have to get the frog, then you need to hop over and you need to go down into like what is sort of like a basement.
Yeah, this is
area.
the
So it
this
must
is
be
this
Nemo's
level.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get the lizard, and then the lizard lets you get the bumblebee, and the bumblebee lets you go up into the attic. The attic reveals the mouse. The mouse breaks through the So
There's actually a pixel perfect. If you can jump over that gap as Nemo to the bee, you can just get the bee. You don't have to get the lizard.
right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Or
yeah,
are
but
you
the-
referring from the lizard to
I
the
think
bee?
the salamander's there as a failsafe if you fuck up and you fall in the pit.
But it's literally pixel perfect to get
Yeah.
over the other side.
Yeah.
Speedrunners usually can't even do it.
And by the
Well,
way,
here-
that the mouse thing, you have to get the mouse and then make sure that it stays up in the attic
you
area,
can't
or else
jump
you're
down.
gonna kill yourself and just want to die to have to do all this over again.
Which is a good opportunity for me to point out of a general frustration that I had with the game, and that the key thing seems to fluctuate in importance throughout the levels. And in a game where it's like the very first stage, this is what you're doing. You're collecting keys, you're opening doors, you're moving on to the next thing. I was frustrated by the fact that if the point of the stage is for me to collect the keys, and I die in the process of doing that, but I have all of the keys, you make it just as difficult and long and tedious for me to like traverse through the map all over again.
Yeah.
And I'm not collecting anything. So I would almost rather like, you need the keys, but when you die, you lose the keys. And then you have to start all over again, because there aren't really any checkpoints in this game. Well, that's
it
not
doesn't
true.
matter.
There are some checkpoints,
There are
but
some,
yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah.
But
I
it'd be
don't know.
nice if, like, let's say the level was a linear level, like a straight pipe to the end of the level, but then there'd be tangent areas that you have to go get the keys. So then, if you do have all of them, you can just beeline it to the end.
Exactly, and that's about stage design.
Yeah.
And in 1990, I can give them some
Some
some credit and some leeway. Yeah. All right. Anything else about Little Nemo's house? Or
I like the monkeys on the plates.
And you mentioned monkeys on plates, and I like those guys a lot. And I think that my favorite weird character, I mean, because some of them are just, it's a fish or it's a snake or it's whatever. But my favorite weird character is in Nemo's house, which is that strange green flying creature in the
that
attic.
Drops
that,
pots?
It drops pots or like green
I thought
olives.
it was barfing out eggs or something.
I thought they were green olives
I
at
thought they
first,
were-
and I was...
Yeah,
Eyeballs?
I thought they were flying turtles, and they dropped turtle shells.
Oh,
Yeah.
man.
I thought there were eggs coming out of flying turtles. By the way, that's my favorite thing about sprites and not seeing the art
Yeah.
behind them is that everyone's
Yeah,
like,
what the hell is this?
I thought that was a completely
Yeah.
different thing.
Yeah, it just looks like this weird long neck thing that shoots pots out of its
Yeah.
mouth, like regurgitates pots.
Yeah, I never thought about it being a turtle. But I mean, it's green and it has a long, long
Neck,
neck, so,
yeah.
so possibly.
It's
but
just
Oh, why is
shot
it
tur-
flying?
Just yeah,
if it's a
shells
flying
out of it now.
turtle, there's your Mario reference again.
Oh shit! There you go.
Exactly. Yeah.
Was there a flying turtle in the movie?
There was no flying turtle in the movie.
Is there
Quite
a-
a few of the enemies were missing from the
Is
film.
there a regurgitating pot monster in the movie?
that didn't make the cut. That was
No.
that certainly sounds like a Morbius thing, though, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So after Nemo's house, it's funny because the game takes you from his house area to his basement to his attic, and I don't know if it's implied that from his attic you go outside and you're in the clouds, but for whatever reason, you end up in the cloud ruins, and this stage is the second and fortunately only other instance of auto-scrolling. But this time it's going vertical, which is less annoying to me for some reason.
It keeps you more on your feet, maybe
Yeah,
more entertained.
I think conceptually this might be my favorite stage.
It's like Kid Icarus style with the way it vertically
Yeah,
scrolls.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. And there's some building traversal, and there is some, it says Cloud Ruins, and there are actual ruins,
Yeah.
like dilapidated buildings and stuff. And I think it's the first kind of, it's like a weird mix of bleak and dreamy.
Yeah.
Because like Nightmare Land, which we'll get to, is a much obviously darker by design, but this, I don't know, there's something cool about this stage to me. And I think this was the stage where the developers first or finally gave up on the whole idea of collecting keys, because like there's
Right.
literally no keys to collect in this stage until the very end, and then they just give them all to you at once, and it's like, oh shit, somebody forgot to plug the keys in. Let's just
Well, the thing is, you couldn't go back into the stage if you needed to.
Yeah, it's not an
So you
open.
might as well
open
just give 'em all
world
at
thing.
once.
Yeah,
But
it's
there are opportunities before you get to the auto-scrolling part, and there's certainly platforms and things. And why can't it be like, I mean, if we're correct on the assumption that at the end of the train stage, if you just die and don't get any keys, then they're just all there waiting for you. Maybe the same thing could have applied. But at this point, you're already wise to their game.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Now, this was also my favorite, or at least one of my favorite stages, and I actually really liked the vertical scrolling part that went down.
Yeah, going
Yeah.
back towards the city.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool and kind of creative, but the only thing that was really annoying is if you didn't take out the float fiend at the top of that, he would follow you the entire way down.
Yeah.
And-
Well,
And-
so yeah, I don't know. That seems like a good opportunity to talk about the float fiends a little bit, since we've just
Oh,
sort of
man.
been cutting in enemies throughout the game. I mean, there's certainly, I can think of an area in Nightmare Land where it's a worst case scenario of the float
yeah.
fiends, but in this stage in particular, I think this is probably the point where you learn to bait the float fiend. Whereas if you like just stand in one place and let it come to you, it'll start to fall straight, and then you can just get out of the way. Another way to sort of
easy,
bait it is
easy,
to jump
easy.
into
In
it.
I was gonna say it's
Yeah,
just
no-
it's easy in thinking about it, but in practice, it's
Sure.
so
But you do it enough, and there are a lot of instances of float fiends in this game. They might be the most common enemy, but you can jump into them and sort of trigger them to drop, and that'll give you even more time to get out of the way.
And this is where the candy does come in useful, because if you hit them and then get them off screen, and then that's it for the rest of the float down.
Something else I hadn't thought about was, is it possible to hit a float fiend with candy. And for people that haven't played this game and you're listening to this episode for some reason, a float fiend is like literally like an evil dandelion.
Yeah.
Just the
spore from a
dandelion seed, yeah.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
Falling.
But I wonder if there's a way to toss a piece of candy, hit a float fiend, trigger his horizontal drop, or a straight path, or whatever you want to call it, and then get out of the way. And it might buy you even more time and make them less of a threat.
Seems complicated.
It does seem complicated, but I think it's the thing that would allow you the most time to get out of the way. I'm not sure.
I will say that they do give you kind of a good amount of space for when they start doing the straight up vertical drop. It's not right above you. If you're a few, another Nemo sprite down from them. You know?
Mm-hmm.
It depends,
Absolutely.
because if you're the place that they bug me the most is in level I think it's 2, that you need the monkey to go up the tree to get the lizard.
Yeah.
They're right there, so you're going upwards, but you're spawning them as you're going upwards, and then all of a sudden they're just right there, and then they just hit you.
The key to that, though, at least I found, was when you're climbing up that tree in that particular level, immediately go to the platform and get as far over as you can. And as they're falling, like there's something about its floating pattern, because it sort of comes at you at a diagonal.
Yeah.
And you can get out of the way because you've given yourself space on that branch. And then it just requires time. I find this is a lot in Little Nemo was just being patient. A prime example of that is back at Little Nemo's house when you're the mouse and you're climbing up the wall. You can probably think of the same room that I'm thinking of, where you need to get vertical and you need to climb up, and there are float fiends coming down, and you've got to like hop off and then wait for them to drop and then hop back up and then hope that you can get to the ledge of the wall before like they fall down again. So I mean, the same can be said about any NES game, but yeah, it's really about patience in a way that like modern games just don't require.
Well, it's like Frank said, anything that involves them being or them being at the top of the screen is just the worst case scenario.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about Cloud Ruins, and
before we move on from Cloud Ruins, I actually wanted to note there is a way. Remember at the very top of Cloud Ruins where there's those spikes at the top?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like the skyscraper top. There is a way to, and it's a pixel perfect jump. And yes, you also have to get hit by an enemy, but you can keep your B for the float downward when it has the downward scrolling area, and that just completely trivializes the float downward because you can just go everywhere.
Awesome.
So what do you just like? What's the term for that in speedrunning? Like damage boosting?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
where
kind of
you're clipping through.
You're using your
cool.
invisibility frames,
Yeah.
Well, that is what you actually get the boost. You get the boost to the right from the enemy, and that gives you just enough wing power to keep on going.
I saw a lot of that in the speedrun, a lot of damage boosting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so from Cloud Ruins, we move on to Topsy Turvy, which I've continued to confuse for Nemo's house because it's very similar.
Well, it's like Upper Dracula's Castle from Symphony of the Night.
It's the flipped up
down
version of his house. Absolutely. And I mean, there's really not too much to say, at least from my point of view. That it doesn't do a whole lot different than
it just gets harder
in Nemo's house.
Yeah.
Turns
it's a very filler episode, not episode, but it's a very filler level, in my opinion.
Yeah,
it's a filler comic strip.
Yeah.
So, but however, so you get bored with this topsy-turvy stage, which is long, and you get the same sort of convoluted key hunt, and you're rewarded at the end with the actual plot to the game, which is really strange because you're introduced to Princess Camille, and she explains that you were brought to Slumberland because her father had been kidnapped by the Nightmare King. So this is where the plot to the film diverges wildly. The Nemo is the reason that, spoiler alert, the King of Slumberland gets kidnapped in the film, and it's interesting, and it's well written. And in this, it's just like, you're lured to Slumberland with the promise of candy, and you're told that you're going to be the playmate of Princess Camille. And then once you get there, you have to slog through the landscape until you get to Princess Camille, and then she reveals that her father's been kidnapped. And I think, we talked about the problem with translations, and I can't help but think that the people that did the localization obviously didn't see the film, but probably didn't speak Japanese very well either.
She also supposedly gives you the scepter, which you already had on your back the whole time.
Which is a thing that I tried to like go, oh, well, that's, you didn't want to redraw the sprite. And I
Right,
get that.
yeah.
But it is sloppy and noticeable.
Well, it's funny because the whole time I was trying to think. I was like, what is that on his back? What is it supposed to represent? And I was like, is it his bag of candy? Maybe. Or is it like a
Sure.
So, to where he's like chucking it out of his back, kind of like how Mario flips
Yeah.
his fireballs out from his boogers or whatever, like.
Yeah.
So I was trying to figure it, but now it makes sense. But then I'm like, yeah, it is funny that he had it the whole time. Maybe I'd like to say that she powered it up.
Could
Yeah,
be. Well, okay, so let's talk about the scepter then, as it pertains to the film. So Nemo, once he shows up to Slumberland, becomes Princess Camille's playmate. The king had other plans for Nemo, which was to make Nemo his heir to Slumberland. He's like, this big jovial old Zeus character. And he wants to bring, he needs a son. Apparently he can't trust his daughter to rule the kingdom or something. But you're as Nemo in the story, in the film, you're given, or he is given, the scepter, and it's the royal scepter. It's called the royal scepter. In the game, Princess Camille gives you a morning star, which I thought was really strange because that's like like a flail, like a fantasy.
The game becomes really
medieval weapon. Yeah,
A bludgeoning tool.
A bludgeoning tool, yeah, exactly. And there's no mention at any point in the video game about Nemo learning the spell that makes it shoot the projectile, but like that's a whole thing in the story. I don't know. This whole thing is going to sound like a commercial for watching the film because it's fantastic. But so that's the point. So you get this really long, unskippable cutscene with the princess, and then you're turned over to Nightmare Land, and it's Nemo's job to travel through Nightmare Land and find the King of Slumberland and free him from the Nightmare King.
A note about the cutscenes. All the cutscenes add up to about a minute and 20 seconds more on the English version than the Japanese version. So it's better to speedrun the Japanese version. Yeah.
I'm assuming because of more text scroll?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But however, in response to that, you can look at you can look at screens of the Japanese version online side by side with the American version, and a good example of that was when I found the information about Flip having the cigar in his mouth and the gorilla and so on. And you can see that the text is not smaller. Like the characters, they're massive characters in comparison to the smaller English text. So that kind of makes me wonder then if the Japanese version is even less coherent.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Plot-wise, So if anybody's listening to this, and I have a couple of friends I know for a fact that will hear this and speak Japanese and read Japanese, get with me. Because I would really like to show you. I mean, it's not a lot of work, but I really want to show you those scenes and see if you can't translate it, or if someone can write into us and tell us, show us a translation, because I wasn't able to come across any. Let's talk about Nightmare Land. And I think that aside from Cloud Runes, Nightmare Land is the most interesting stage
setting
in the game. And I would say that this is the action becomes more... Yeah, there's no keys, and you're actually told by Camille for some inexplicable reason that you won't need keys. I guess that's so you don't go through the level hoping to find them or being... even though it is it's just a completely flat... or not totally
straight
flat, with some verticality to it, but it's a very much a straightforward platformer. And this is the point where it most seems like Mega Man to me for a Capcom game, even down to
the music.
The music.
Oh yeah, the music is great,
super
especially
Mega
this
Man.
first part.
Right.
Yeah,
it's very Mega Man.
Yeah, it's like a Mega Man 4 song. It's not as good. It's not good enough to be 2 or 3, but like it seems like something that would have been from 4 on, in my opinion.
There's actually a lot that changes the game in this. Not just the fact that you have a scepter or whatever, or Morningstar that can now shoot projectiles, but even the background. You know, I grew to love this first stage of Nightmare Land just because I had to play it over and over again because I kept dying at the boss the first time. But it, you know, it has that like glowing crystallized background, and if you pause it, it's still animating.
Oh, cool!
Like,
I never noticed.
Also very Mega Man-esque, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Doesn't Gemini Man stage do that too? Or am I thinking of somebody else?
It's one of those stages definitely does. And yeah, so I was playing this on kind of a questionable cart just because it was old and I got it from this crusty old toy store.
And you couldn't be bothered to clean it?
The cart itself, it wasn't dirty. It was just crusty because it was like, it had Dave written on it in a permanent marker, you know, like it was just like, it took me, I think the reason I beat it so quickly is because every time that I played it, every time I put it in, I probably had to try for about 10 minutes straight to get it to work.
Oh man.
So when I got to Nightmare Land, it started glitching out like crazy. And this is when, like, you know, the bottom bar where it has Nemo's health and everything, as soon as you moved to the right in the stage, it would just start filling up with random letters and numbers. So I was kind of on a race to beat the
fully glitched.
Yeah, it was fully glitched. Maybe a couple of times it worked normally, but it's kind of like memorable to me now to play through that stage and just think about the enemies would eventually, if I played long enough, they would turn into kind of blocks that are moving around. And sometimes it played normally, but most of the time it was like me trying to race the glitches. So that's what I think about when I think of Nightmare Land now.
Yeah. You know, so let's just talk briefly. Like, Nightmare Land is the first stage in the game that is divided into 3 parts. And if you die in the stage on any of the 3 parts, you have to go back to the first part. If I'm not mistaken, does that sound right?
No, if you game over, then you have to go back.
Yeah, you have to go to the first part.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I meant. And so it is divided into 3 stages with a boss, first time in the game where you're fighting a boss. At the end of each of the 3 substages. And I don't know, does anyone want to talk about Nightmare Land? Is there anything specific? Because this is kind of the end of the game. Anything really stand out to you as being particularly interesting about Nightmare Land?
I think what Joseph said is like the background is really different and very cool. It very pops out. Like it's these purple spires and colors, and it's very nice.
You know, mentioning the background, a neat thing about that, I feel, is the inclusion of the foreshadow of the Nightmare King in
Part 3.
That's
That's
great.
really cool.
You know, like not too many. I mean, there's probably a handful of instances of that in NES games, but like to have that, like
It's an
this
awesome
massive
touch.
creature looming.
It reminds
you know,
me. It reminds me a lot of Ninja Gaiden. I don't know why.
I mean, visually, he totally has that, that sort of color scheme of like being mostly black with purple highlights, and then you know, like the orange flecks or whatever. That definitely feels like Ninja Gaiden. For sure.
Reminds me of Rygar, where you can see Lygar's castle, like near.
Oh,
the
yeah,
end.
yeah,
You can see it way in the beginning, but you can't get to it till later.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do have some notes about so the penguin boss. I heard and read about this. You can only, when you use the scepter or the Morningstar or whatever it is to actually harm them, every 3rd pixel that you're able to stand on doesn't actually do, like where you're standing, you can't actually do damage to the penguin, and that's why some fights last longer than others. It's really janky, weird.
So it's not that he has extra health. It's just you're not damaging him.
If you watch like a speed run, you know you can beat him in like 4 hits. 4 charged hits, or not even fully charged. Yeah, it just depends where you're standing.
I've fussed with him, and I didn't even. I guess like I'd be interested to hear if any of you guys had the same experience. But my initial attempts at fighting the Penguin King was completely melee. I would run over to him and do a jumping attack, and just because you can get a handful of them in there, and I just. For some reason, I guess maybe I had watched the movie and I was just thinking, well, the scepter, the beam of the scepter is used for the stingray and used for the Nightmare King. And for some reason, I was like, what is this giant penguin?
You just had to go totally canon with
as
it.
well. Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't by design, but So did anyone try to like take this thing out manually? No. Okay.
I had no idea.
Yeah, And I beat him that way. I will admit, when I did that, I was using save states because I was like, "There's got to be a way to beat this guy," and so I just practiced it over and over again that way.
Kudos.
And it was a pain in the ass.
How many
but
hits did
for
it
sure.
take you?
Oh, I didn't count them. A lot. I mean, after talking with Joseph about it and him going, yeah, you only need 6 fully charged hits to beat the Penguin King, I was like, well, that sounds a lot easier. And so I did it, and, you can count them, and that works that way. But, hearing the thing that Brian said about the pixels. Every third
It's
pixel.
variable. I had a run where it was like 10 hits.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's I guess it's kind of interesting. I mean, I guess I'm fine with it being that way. I'm not fine with knowing that it works that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
But I wonder if it's by design or if it's just
It's got to be
mess
designed
up.
because it's not like no other bosses are like that.
Yeah, I wonder. So, last but not least, there's really not too much to say about the Nightmare Land in general. There's a lot of fire, a lot of rock. It's very similar to like lava stages in any given
Yeah.
platformer.
Well, I think
it's-
this is the hardest level, the second to last part
Oh,
of
yeah.
Nightmare
it is
Land.
pretty
I think
hard.
it's completely the toughest, and it's very unforgiving with hit boxes as far as dodging fire
Yeah.
goes. Like that's very, you'll get so annoyed every time you kind of you're like, okay, I'm definitely out of the range of this, and then Nemo will do his little like boop, and you'll get hit, and if you lose 1 health bar in this, it's pretty precarious.
Yeah, it's detrimental.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I did want to note, like, I was thinking about this, like, doing the charge shots, is it really better to do rapid fire or try to charge it all the way up? And from all the speedruns I've seen, charging
It's
it
full
up,
charge, yeah.
Yeah, full charge is
Well,
best.
if you watch the same speedrun that Joseph and I watched, the guy doesn't fully charge it.
Well, mostly charge it, not
Mostly
just like,
charges it. Yeah.
not like rapid fire.
We're not
yeah.
really given any sort of indication, though, as to, like, how much of
And-
a charge shot works,
And I think that would have been good. This is the one thing I would change. I would give him the bosses a health. Like,
Oh,
bar.
absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The same can be said about most, any NES
Yeah.
games of that variety.
Right. There was one other exploit that I saw during that one section above the alligators where you have to get the lizard, and then from the lizard you get the frog. You can damage boost the lizard up above, and then you don't have to get the mouse at all. Or I think there's a mouse up top or something. But anyway, like when you get to that next section, that's where the spikes were coming down on your head. Like,
yeah.
it's like the Mario 3 where it kind of comes down on you.
Right.
They didn't program a hitbox in for those spikes for the lizard, so you
No,
can
so
jump
you
right
can
through
just.
them.
Oh, nice.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I saw that. I noticed the guy was
Yeah.
skipping. He was just kind of
Yep.
jumping
You
up
can
through the
totally
spikes.
just jump
And I didn't
straight
think
through it.
why. I just thought
Yeah.
he had did something that I wasn't saying. But
Right,
no,
I
that's
thought
interesting.
originally I thought it was just too low on the lizard, but no, you I saw like you can jump straight through it and not connect anything.
So after you deal with the Penguin King through stage 2, you eventually come to the second of 3 bosses in the game, and this boss is actually handled much in the same way that he is in the film. It is a giant purple, purpley gray colored manta ray, and it flies across and does these sort of aerial bombardments against Nemo, and
Shoots
you
fire.
have to hit him. Yeah, and I don't recall in the film. I don't think he breathes any fire in the film,
okay.
but otherwise it's quite faithful. And you can beat him fairly easily. You can kind of just stay off to the left.
This is the one I had the most trouble with because when he would zoom through, like I sometimes
Yeah, I
didn't
mean you're
have
going to
the
take
time
some
to
hits
react.
for sure.
Yeah.
You have a split second
Yeah.
basically to notice which direction he's flying down from.
Yeah.
Like left or right, diagonal.
And once you're done with the manta ray, it's on to the Nightmare King himself. And as we mentioned earlier, the traveling through this stage, you're reminded, it's not very long either. It's certainly the shortest of the 3. And you are reminded of what lies in store. And, he's there sort of looming in the background. And I liked this boss fight in particular. Out of the 3, I found it to be the most fun. With the Penguin King, he just kind of comes down on one side or the other, and then you don't really... it's easy to get frustrated with the Manta Ray, at least to me, but with the Nightmare King, you kind of always see him, but he moves. He sort of vomits out these bio molds.
Slime
Yeah, I don't
balls
know
or-
what else to call them, like some sort of like vomiting out like a growth. And that sort of floats around, but it's not. You're never really overwhelmed by that aspect of it. And once you learn his beam attacks, it's not too hard to beat.
No, I found them to be much easier than the other two,
Yeah,
to be honest.
very
with you.
predictable.
More fitting, I think, with the with the overall difficulty level of the game and the vibe of it. I really just wonder why the game, since it took a lot of other liberties with the film, and boss battles at the end of each stage are a staple of gaming. I wonder why they didn't decide to try to incorporate more bosses in the game. Because there's certainly enemies that Nemo doesn't fight in the cartoon or in the in the comic book. So
I have a strange feeling that halfway through development they probably said, "All right, let's switch this up," or like, they play test.
We need some bosses.
Yeah, they play tested and they're like, "Ah, man, these key things are not working out." So,
well, the thing is, they would have required kind of Nemo to have a certain animal power for the boss. Like you'd have to have a bee or something,
a gimmick,
something with yeah.
And at that point, you're treading dangerously close to Mega Man. Being like a blatant ripoff.
You need the bee
at that
to
point, you
beat
might
this
as well, you might as well just give you all of the animals once you unlock them. Which I think would have been a fun game. Like it would have been awesome if
that
you
sounds awesome.
Fight the bee boss, unlock the bee, and then move on to the next thing. I would have been fine with that, and I wouldn't have cared. I don't think kids in general in that time frame would have had any sort of reservations.
It
about
takes
that
away
being too much like Mega Man.
It takes away that magical moment when you first get on the first level and you get that first frog and you're like, what am I doing? Like, this is crazy.
I was like, it does. I am glad they did it this way because it's actually ends up being pretty novel in the lineup of NES games, just to have this kind of structure. Like you never have something like this.
For sure. And I think that, this was a game that lived and died by its novelty, by its gimmick. Because if you held this up to the light against the Mega Man, or Bionic Commando, or something else from that era, it's not as polished.
No.
And so you're right. It would have had to have been a completely different game, and then who knows if we'd be talking about it at this point, because it would have just been a little too close to scrutinize. Okay, so we've gone through the game, we've talked about the mechanics, we've talked about the level design, we've talked about all the things that we love. One thing that you cannot discuss a Capcom game and leave out is the music. And I don't know about you guys, but as in the pantheon of Capcom related soundtracks, this one has some pretty good doozies. Does anyone have any special songs in particular? I mean, obviously the title screen and stage one, it really stands out to most folks because if you played it at all, you certainly heard those. But I know somebody, you guys mentioned like certain stages having themes that that resonated with you more so than others.
A lot of the tunes had very, infantile, whimsical, given the theme, had these waltzes, which were nice. It kind of annoying if you left them on too long. But
so my memories of this game are so closely associated with the soundtrack, and then I've played through this almost 2 times completely since we decided to do this, and much of those playthroughs were spent repeating the same thing over and over again, and of course hearing the music over and over again. And today, in preparation for recording the show tonight, I decided to listen to the soundtrack while I went over my notes, and I found the soundtrack was a little bit grating at this point, if I'm being honest with you.
Totally.
I mean, in the major scope of things for Capcom music, it's pretty good. In company that is great. But there's certainly some things where like it could have used a little longer. Like some of the tracks are just too short. But overall, it's still like it's earwormy. There are, especially that stage one with the sort of like 4/4 rock beat to it. It is my favorite. And then I think at this point in time, I think I like the waltz from Topsy Turvy and the Nightmare Land music, which I said is kind of like a Mega Man, a later Mega Man.
Pseudo Mega Man.
Yeah.
Well, did the composer do any Mega Man soundtracks? Or?
Yes, actually, this is a good opportunity to mention that. So Junko Tamiya, the name may or may not ring a bell with a lot of folks, but when this game was released, and Brian, you might have to help me on this one. When she did Bionic Commando, it was under the title of Gunzo as well, right?
I really just think it was Junko Tamiya. I don't really.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't really.
Yeah.
Know.
Well, okay. So I got a little bit ahead of myself. So much in the same way that the director of the game had a massive Capcom pedigree under his belt, so did Gonzo or Junko Tamiya, if you prefer. Gunsmoke. I'm not super familiar with it. I didn't own it as a kid and play it much. I don't know. Does anyone have any familiarity with the music to that?
No, not overly.
Yeah, so she did that in 1988, which is one of her first ones for Capcom, and then went on immediately after to do Bionic Commando, which is huge. I mean, I know that's one of Brian's favorite NES
my
games.
favorite,
mine too.
Nintendo, track or soundtrack.
Yeah, it's excellent. No one needs to say anything about Bionic Commando. It's up there. From there, she also did Strider. Which I can kind of take or leave, specifically the arcade version. And she did Final Fight, which I know that Joseph shares an affinity for with me as being one of the great Capcom soundtracks.
Absolutely.
And she does a title that may possibly end up on our list at one point to do an episode on, which is Sweet Home, which is kind of an obscure predecessor to Resident Evil, kind of a haunted house game, appropriately spooky music. Codename Viper, played it once or twice as a kid, don't really have a whole lot of familiarity with the music. And then Street Fighter 2010, which I think is great music, but maybe not so much a
music,
great game.
terrible game.
Yeah. Exactly. And there was an interesting interview that I read with Junko Tamiya where she had mentioned that initially she was not supposed to be the soundtrack composer for Little Nemo. And she was simultaneously making the soundtrack for Street Fighter 2010.
No way.
And she had been, up to that point, had been making all of this like triumphant rock music, which is, I think that's probably an appropriate statement. I mean, Sweet Home doesn't really fall into that, but if you look at the rest of her catalog for Capcom there, I think that's apt. But yeah, so she got asked to do the soundtrack for Capcom, or probably instructed at that point. And did so, and she comments on having had a hard time transitioning from the type of music she was used to writing for Capcom to this, whimsical music, as we described it.
Yeah.
And said that once she figured out how to do it, though, it all fell into place and became very easy for her to do. So I thought that was a pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's great
Anecdote there. Concluding thoughts, final thoughts. Little Nemo, almost 27 years later. What's everybody's final thoughts on the game? Did you enjoy it as much as you did as a kid? Does it have a whole new meaning to you? What do you think?
I don't know. For me personally, it was this game that I never owned. It was this magical type game where you would possess animals, and it was never done after, really. And I thought it was really cool. And in the back of my mind, it was always like, when you think of NES classics that are not mainstream, like the Mega Mans and the Contras and the Castlevanias, you kind of think of Little Nemo definitely is one of them, because it stood out as a NES game for sure, even if it wasn't that good. It was
I would say I still enjoyed playing it. I don't know that I loved it. I
don't see myself popping it in the weekend to play it again.
Yeah, I mean, now that the show is done, my enthusiasm for the game will probably, smolder down. But yeah, no, I want to say, we had talked earlier about having, some sort of rating system, and I think I'm going to call this one 3.5 invisible cigar smoking gorillas out of 5.
Nice. I would definitely give it not even a 3.5. I give it a 3 throwing candies into the mouth of a frog out of 5.
Ratings? Final thoughts?
I'll just say I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised, because I wasn't having not really remembered anything past the first level. I was surprised at how cleverly designed some of the challenges were, in that it was more than, even though it was very straightforward, like where you had to go do one thing after the other specifically, it was still pretty thoughtful. And the variety, and like I said, the structure of it being different from other NES games made it stand out. Again, it's not something I'm going to pop in anytime soon again. I'm pretty much done with it for the foreseeable future, but I have fond memories of playing it this time.
I would have liked it better if I wasn't, I don't know, I was frustrated. I was frustrated as a kid playing it. I was frustrated this time around too. I think some of that was some gameplay jank, but yeah, it had some very good parts. The art and the music I think was very good. So I'd probably give it 3 out of 5 Werther's unoriginals for potentially unoriginal content of geting inside of frog suits.
What was your rating, Joseph? You didn't lay it on us.
I'd probably give it 3.5 unmagical mushrooms, because unfortunately there's nothing too psychedelic here.
It's pretty straightforward, other than that topsy-turvy level. It's it's okay. It's not that trippy.
So if you're listening to this and you are interested in revisiting this game, I have some bad news for you. Unfortunately, it is not available on any of the current system home consoles. There's no PSN or Wii U Virtual Console available. You can, of course, find it on the secondhand seller's market.
You have to go in the wild.
Yeah, you have to run out into the wild, which, honestly, if we're going to be honest, like that's probably the most fun way that you're going to find this game anyhow.
Yeah, go to a flea market, buy some pierogies or whatever they sell there, and then do you guys have pierogies in the States?
If you go to a flea market in Greece, go ahead and have or Poland or wherever makes pierogies.
Flea markets here, we have pierogies. It's great. Anyways,
Frank's like the most he's like not clicking with it. He's like, go get some poutine and get the game.
So should you buy this game secondhand, I'm here to tell you that you can get it fairly inexpensive, probably cheaper than it would be were you to buy it digitally in some sort of marketplace now. The going rate seems to be just about $8, and should you find it complete in box, it's even more reasonable, I think, considering what you're getting, and that's it runs about $32.67, which was the price found. And if you found a brand new wrapped one, you're looking at about $200.
Which kind of, $7 is not. That's certainly not a lot. Like Bayou Billy goes for $5, or a couple of bucks, yeah. So I guess it was probably overproduced and underappreciated.
Yeah, I think that's why everybody knows the game but still hasn't played it, because it was everywhere.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Okay, so that's Little Nemo. I think we've explored some new depths to the game and talked about all we've milked this cow costume to great length, and we're ready to discuss and reveal the next game that's coming up. And we're doing this round table style. Round robin choice is going to be made by the next guy in line, and that person just happens to be Joseph. So Joseph, what game have you picked for our next adventure?
Well, we're going in blind. You guys don't know the game, so I'm just going to say it here. It's Joe and Mac for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
That's all right. I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah. That sounds like a fun one. All right, awesome. So
I enjoy that game. That's okay.
So in addition to the reveal of the next game, we have a little segment that we're doing at the end here called Doki Doki Powerline. And Joseph, you kind of came up with this idea. So do you want to talk a little bit briefly about what Doki Doki Powerline is?
Yeah. So I was thinking it'd be good just to get everyone else involved with the whole project, is to send us, in this time we have 2 weeks now until the next episode. So send us your best tips for this game. They could be codes. They could be exploits.
And by this game, you specifically mean
I mean Joe and Mac. Yes, Joe and Mac for the next title. But this, moving forward, just whatever the next game will be. So yeah, tell us your best tips, and I guess we'll choose the best one, right? Is that a plan?
Yeah, that's the plan. So I think what's going to happen is you've got, before we record the next episode, so 2 weeks from today, we're going to attempt to do another one of these, and or 2 weeks from the day that we publish. So 2 weeks from the day that the podcast goes live, sounds about right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes
I
sense.
don't know. We'll have to figure out we'll post online, and we'll get everybody a date.
Maybe like the day before, so we can read it up before we make a decision before we record.
But we'll make a selection, and we'll try to put together a little something to commemorate the person with the best tip, and we'll spread it across the internet and praise you for your genius. And to sort of set a precedence for this, Joseph, you had a tip that you wanted to share about Little Nemo, am I correct?
Yes. So this is the level select code, and it actually came in handy since I was playing on a cart, and I was able to, I didn't have to just leave my NES running, which I did once. I left it on for about 3 hours, came back to a pretty hot cart.
Same here.
Yeah, so this comes in handy. What you do is on the at the title screen, you press up, select, left, right, A, B, and a dream select message will pop up. So however many levels you want to skip, you hit the A button that many times, and then press start, and you're there.
And that concludes the maiden voyage of the SS Doki Doki Game Club. As we pull our dream dirigible back into port, I want to thank my co-host for joining me on this trek through Slumberland. Who are you guys, and where can people find you online if they want to get in touch?
Well, like you said, my name is Joseph Luster. You can find me online at a variety of places. On Twitter, I'm at Moldilux, Moldilox, and that's also the name I've done a few chiptune albums off of. I'm sure you can find those. That's about the last time I ever did music. So, and other than that, you can find me at subhumanzoids.com, and that's where I do a lot of comics and stuff like that. Oh yeah, and I also do have a job in sort of tangential to this industry. I write for Otaku USA and Crunchyroll, and I cover video games most of the time. So you can find me at those places too.
All right. How about Brian?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at KenoShinobi, and that's pretty much it. I also am a regular contributor to shitpost.nsf on Facebook, so look us up there.
Subscribe.
Yep.
Please,
like and like often.
If you like this podcast, you'll 100%
Absolutely.
like Shitpost on NSF.
Definitely.
Absolutely. All right, Frank, how about you?
Frank Martin. I'm from the Interbuts. You can get me on Hios_IO on Twitch. On Twitter. On Twitch, you can get me at Hios_. I do some streaming, and I do actually stream some of the games that we will play, so you can kind of get a feeling of what I'm feeling for the game live. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at it, I guess. And what about you, Brendan?
And if you want to follow me personally, you can do so at Genocide, DJINNOCIDE on Twitter. And you can find and follow the show online. We have a website. It's dokidokigameclub.com. On Twitter, we are at dokidokigc. And we have a Facebook group and a YouTube channel. And if you search for Doki Doki Game Club on either of those, we should pop right up. So if you enjoyed the show and you'd like to support us, there's a number of great ways you can do that. Word of mouth is hugely important. If you have anyone in your life who enjoys video games, please send them a link to the show and let them know about us. Hopefully by the time you're listening to this, we'll be up on iTunes. So even if you don't have an iPhone or use iTunes to listen to the show, if you can head over there and write us a review, it would mean a whole lot. Lots of other podcast services use iTunes data for rankings, and writing a review makes us more visible in the podcast world. And last but not least, we have a Patreon. So if you have a couple of bucks you can spare and would like to contribute to the show in that manner, please head over to patreon.com/Doki Doki Game Club, and you can do so there. And there will be notes to all of these links in the show notes. We want to give a special thank you shout out to Cheap Dinosaurs for allowing us to use their song Tagalog as the theme to Doki Doki Game Club. It's the official theme song of Doki Doki Game Club, and it's awesome. And check out Cheap Dinosaurs on Bandcamp or other places online. So on behalf of Brian, Frank, Joseph, and myself, thanks for listening, and until next time,
Adios, Battletoads.